By the time the 90s rolled around, the WRC was in a more calm and collected state after the whole action of Group B had subsided. Of course, coming out of the other side of Group B had left a lot of manufacturers with nowhere to go and nothing to race with. Lancia was the obvious exception here, who quickly used their experience and expertise to put together the Delta HF, which had no competition. They used the first few years after Group B to dominate while the other manufacturers had to play catch up. But it had been a few years since Group B now, and some manufacturers were beginning to rear their heads once again. Toyota was the main one, continuing to race their ST165, and raced it so well they were able to get their driver Carlos Sainz the driver's title. There were others too. Mitsubishi had a crack at the sport again with their Galant VR4, a huge chunky beast that, despite weighing the same as a large elephant, managed to claim a few victories for its own trophy cabinet throughout the late 80s and early 90s. There was another Japanese manufacturer too, Subaru, racing their Legacy RS. It was nowhere near as successful as its peers, winning a sole event in 1993, but it did lay the groundwork for a potential world beater just a few years down the line. Despite this, Lancia were unfazed and picked up their 4th consecutive manufacturer's title, but only by 6 points. 1990 is generally said to be the point where Group A cars began to overtake Group B cars. Despite being way down on power compared to their older brothers, the new racers were lighter, cheaper, had better handling, and most importantly were far safer. 1991 came around, still continuing Lancia's winning streak, but only by 9 points in the end. Toyota weren't going to take this Italian steamrolling lightly, they were quickly catching up. 1992 was a similar story. Lancia took the win, but Toyota was riding their coattails. Speaking of Toyota, they had now launched and homologated their Celica ST185, featuring a 2-litre turbocharged inline 4, raising the power output to around 300 horsepower. The launch of the newer Celica also signalled the impending Japanese invasion that the WRC was about to experience. As the sport entered the 1990s, it was dominated by Europeans as it had been since the beginning, such as the Audi 90 Quattro, the Ford Sierra Cosworth, the BMW M3, the Renault Clio, and of course, the Lancia Delta Integrale. However, the next few years saw an uprising from the Japanese manufacturers. Of course, this began with Toyota and their Celica, but other manufacturers like Subaru, Mitsubishi, Mazda and others started to leave the shadows as well. Sure, they were all already competing, but not to any great levels of success. Take Subaru for example, they had been, as already said, racing the Legacy RS, a heavy, bulky sedan that simply couldn't keep up with the likes of the Delta. Smaller and lighter was the way to go, so in 1993 Subaru launched the world-renowned Impreza WRC, of course based on the road-going Subaru Impreza WRX. It had a 2-litre boxer engine, which isn't quite the same as an inline engine, but it still made around 300 horsepower. The same goes for Mitsubishi. They were racing the heavy, sluggish Galant, practically a full-sized boat, before transitioning into the smaller, faster Lancer Evo. Both of these cars, as well as the Celica, started picking up wins left and right, and despite the Europeans trying to fight back, they couldn't. Even the Delta, which by 1993 had a record-breaking 6 manufacturers' titles and 4 drivers' titles to its name, was slipping fast. 1993 would have been their 7th manufacturer's title. But unfortunately, or to Toyota, very fortunately, the Celica had finally overtaken the Italians, and 1993 was the year of Toyota after they took the manufacturer's title themselves, and Juha Kankkunen, who had now moved from Lancia to Toyota, took the driver's title. 1993 would sadly prove to be the final year of the historic Lancia racing team. A legacy that had been going strong since the 1960s was ended by what can only be described as a catastrophic final season. However, despite it being out of competition for almost 30 years now, Lancia still holds the most manufacturers' titles in history, something to be remembered. But this does bring up the question, why were the Japanese only just now becoming so dominant? Was it something about Group A that enticed them so much more than anything previously? Well, let's have a look at the rulebook. Up until 1991, the Group A rulebook said that the manufacturer had to build 5,000 units of the car that they wanted to homologate, disregarding how many of the base car the manufacturer was building already. This was a lot. However, in 1991 it was changed to just 2,500 models out of a total 25,000 base model capacity. For example, Subaru would have to build 2,500 Impreza WRXs out of the total 25,000 base Imprezas. This doesn't really seem to mean anything, but Japan in the late 80s and early 90s was well known for their tuner and sports car culture. Every brand under the rising sun was contributing their sporty sedans and hatchbacks to the Japanese domestic market, and this included the likes of Toyota, Subaru and Mitsubishi. Simply put, they were already producing road-legal cars by the thousands with raised power output, so it was much easier for them to homologate models for the WRC. They were already doing it. Europe didn't have a culture anywhere near this level. Sure, there were outliers like Lancia and Ford, but they didn't produce their versions nearly as much as the Japanese did. Back when the requirement was just 200 units, i.e. Group B, European manufacturers were far more inclined to compete. Still, there were some Europeans remaining, such as Renault, Skoda and of course Ford, who had now moved on back to their roots with the Escort. The Ford Escort RS Cosworth was based on the Mark V Escort and was similar in many regards to the Sierra Cosworth, mainly the massive whale-tail wing that remains iconic to this day. It featured a turbocharged 2-litre inline-4 making 310 horsepower. This was the only true contender to the Japanese, but the 1994 WRC was once again taken by Toyota, who were now racing both the Celica ST185 and the ST205 in unison, and the driver's title was once again in their hands too, this time for the Frenchman Didier Auriol. The 90s were now well underway, and the Japanese had truly vanquished the long-standing might of the Europeans. As time went on, however, it would become a vicious fight between manufacturers for the title, and the next few years would go down in legend as some of the finest in motorsporting history.